The hope of generations. The story of Wynnewood's rich Black history. The story of Wynnewood's white population is captured from one century to the next in black and white, page after page, picture after picture. But you cannot tell the whole story of Wynnewood without telling the story of its Hopewell community, the Black Woods, and those who call them home.
Hello, I'm John McNeil, Wynnewood, Oklahoma. My parents were Joe and Rena Pearl McNeil. I went to school in Wynnewood. I was born February 16th, 1940.
I am Vera Sampson Rushing. I am the daughter of J.C. and Della Harper Sampson. I was born in Wynnewood, Oklahoma on January 14th, 1939.
Hello, my name is Clinton Edward Johnson, and I'm the son of Gladys Pearl and Tommy Lee Johnson. I was born in Wynnewood, Oklahoma on May the 18th, 1947.
Oh, my name Mildred L. Smith, Mildred Lee Smith, and I was born May the 5th and 32.
These men and women are the living legacy of Wynnewood's Black history.
I currently serve as the president of the Hopewell Cemetery Association.
Clinton Edward Johnson is among the few remaining descendants of the original Black settlers. They are the memory keepers, the storytellers who keep alive the oral histories passed down from generation to generation, the stories of the Hopewell community and the Black Woods.
When you look on the territorial maps, you'll find Negro settlements. Sometimes they're specifically identified. Other times they're not, it's just Negro settlements. And that's significant because there's really very little known about these settlements. And so your project is opening the door for not just the investigations that you're doing with the Black settlement really around Cherokee Town that's going to eventually be incorporated into Wynnewood, but you're opening the door for other people, other historians to engage in finding out more about these Black settlements, you know. So, I mean, I feel very positive about this.
With a master's in African American Studies and a PhD in American Studies, both from Yale University, Dr. Tanya Anderson is an expert not only in American history, but in America's Black history.
When we talk about the Black communities that formed as a result of opening up the territories, then we have to look at the reasons why they came here and what Oklahoma signified. For Blacks coming in from other states, and especially southern states, Oklahoma was a beacon of hope. It offered the promise of providing them an environment in which they could succeed or fail without the obstacles of racism and violence and so forth that plagued freedmen in the former Confederate states.
Like Hope itself, the Hopewell community sprang up in the 1860s, but there are accounts that place its humble beginnings as far back as the late 1850s.
Dana Bell Smith. I am the granddaughter of Jane Smith, who was First Lady to give the land and help build Hopewell Baptist Church. My parents were Zach Smith and Mattie Smith, which my mother passed when I was 7 years old. My father raised me, helped raise me and 4 more sons that he had. And I went to school at Brown Springs and Lincoln High School. And I was baptized when I was 13 years old in a tank, which young people don't know what I'm talking about, but it's a homemade place where they water their stock. And I'm fixing to explain that to the young folks too. Stock means the animals that they had to water. Just a few things I remember my mother before she passed. But my father married 2 years later to Lady Melissa Smith.
At 91, the memories of her father are still vivid and filled with pride.
He never had tractors on his land. He always had horses and whatever, and grew fruit, pecans, and whatever. He was good.
For Zach Smith and others, less than a generation from slavery, the Hopewell community was a place not only of hope, but of dreams come true. Among the first black citizens of Hopewell to call Wynnewood home, the Dixie Smith Sr. family, the Harper family, the Allen family, and the Kemps. Albert and Nettie Lewis would move from the Big Woods to the growing Garvin County town. But there would be no Wynnewood, Hopewell, or the Big Woods without its native influence.
The first blacks to come into Oklahoma accompanied the 5 tribes as they were forced out of the Southeast. And so, the question of what was life like for them? And then how did that change? Of course, the Civil War is going to be a very important period of transition, both for the tribes and for their former slaves. And that transition in terms of Black-Indian relations is going to shift dramatically. And Reconstruction within the Indian Territory was dramatic. The tribes lost the western half of their entire territory, effectively splitting Indian Territory in half, where you have Oklahoma Territory that would occupy the western half of the state, and then the old Indian Territory. So dramatic changes there, and that change had direct impact upon Native American and relations with their former slaves.
This holds true in the case of the future town of Wynnewood, with cultures sometimes colliding, abiding, and eventually relying on one another to build a new community.
Now, Cherokee Town was a trading post that was established as a Cherokee crossing for wagon trains and whatever that went through that area, crossing a bridge that was constructed to go primarily taking supplies and whatever from southeastern part of Oklahoma and down into Texas, crossed that trail up going when they were forming Fort Sill Army Base in Lawton. So the trail or the road that was being built went past that, basically the Cherokee Town. Now, Cherokee Town has a history that dates back to 1839, when some of the Cherokee tribe members that were in Texas were ran out of Texas and came up, a loose band of Indians that settled around that area. Cherokee Town was what later became Wynnewood, because what happened is once the railroads ran through this area running south, and they didn't go past Cherokee Town, they went further west to Wynnewood on the other side of the Washita River. And after that happened, all of the trafficking came down that way from the south, from the north to the south, that resulted in Cherokee Town pretty much drying up. So the ones that were there then relocated over to Wynnewood, which was about 4 miles southwest of the Cherokee Town.
That is when the entire town of Cherokee Town was moved and renamed Walner. Together, these diverse communities created a new community, which would eventually become the southern Oklahoma town of Wynnewood. A man known only as Mr. Graves would launch his own grassroots movement to get more black families to make the move to Wynnewood. Among them, families like the Russells, Pattons, the Loves, the Eastmans, the Blues family. There were the Cochrans, the Vaughns, the Wileys, Mitch Wright and his family. Others making the move from Hopewell and the Bickwoods were the Goodwins, the Coxes, the Douglas family, the Sparks, McKinneys, the Ruckers, and Reverend Gill, who was ready to feed the soul of a soulful people.
Hello, I'm Pastor James Greenwood. I was born in Wynnewood, Oklahoma, September 7th, 1943. My dad was Norman Greenwood, and my mother was Ruth Smith King.
Black churches continue to provide spiritual guidance to Black Wynnewood.
My grandmother passed before I was born, but she gave the land to build a church.
Armed with a good book and a message of hope, the Hopewell community erected a church, opening its doors in 1866. It would also be used later to educate the community's youth.
I started my schooling at Brown Springs School in the Hopewell church area. And that's where I went to church at with my family and Zach Smith. Zach Smith was my grandfather on my mother's side.
Hopewell Church was the first black church to dot the landscape of the area, but not the last. Mount Carmel Baptist would open its doors in 1891, Mount Olive Baptist in 1901, Mount Zion in 1910, the Methodist Episcopal Church known as Reed's Chapel in the early 1900s, and the Holiness Church, Powerhouse Church of God in Christ. Those who remember say they can still hear the ringing of the Hopewell church bell, signaling a death in their close-knit community.
Church people going to church. Everybody went to church then.
Hopewell Church, like the community itself, was trailblazing. In 1893, under the leadership of Reverend John Peters, Hopewell Church hosted the meeting for the Chickasaw District Missionary Baptist Association. In 1912, members would organize an old folks reunion, an all-day event with church services morning and afternoon and dinner.
The main thing I remember about it was on the second Sunday in July, they had what they call old folk reunion. And so the first time that I remember it, they had horses and buggies and food and singing and shouting, and the ministers were preaching, and I was just a little girl, but my grandma said, I'm going to take you out there this Sunday. So we go out there, and it was so amazing to see all these people, and they were so happy to see each other. And when they said reunion, it didn't click until I got home. Of course, I was young, but I would always have a dictionary, and I'd go see what reunion really meant. And reunion to me, after I saw that, it was classic, because everybody was so happy to see each other, and it seemed like everybody was kin to everybody.
I can remember one of the most pleasant thing I can remember at Hopewell was the old folks reunion. And that was something I wish the kids, we could have been taking pictures back then. We had a $60 gallon barrel what our water was in, and they put 100 pounds of ice in that 60-gallon barrel, and it kept water cold all day for us at the reunion. And people drunk out of a dipper. They dip in the water and drink and hang it back up, and they get through. The next person come through and get them to drink water the same way. And we had our baskets. It was a dinner, a free dinner. And them old women would fix dinner in tubs and dish pans, and we didn't have boxes. They couldn't afford the box, couldn't come to town and get the boxes. But this is what we had. We didn't have laundry baskets and all this good stuff. And the dish pans and things, and the men sometimes would barbecue, but we very seldom had barbecue till later on. And you go around from one person to the other and get what you want out of their food if you want it. And we had a good time. And we had, I imagine it was 100 people would come to it.
Oh, I remember I used to sing. I used to sing in the church until I was going to Lincoln High School, and somebody stole the bell out of the church. Then they burned the church down. So that was that.
From feeding the soul to fueling the future, the Hopewell community pulled together to make certain that their children receive the best education possible.
The idea of educated Black people or Black professionals was essential in helping to create a structure of leadership by which African American people as a whole could seek to empower themselves. So with professionals, one of the most respected professions historically within the Black community was the Black teacher, the Black educator. In terms of professionals,
Hopewell School, the first territorial school in the area, welcomed students of all races and was taught in Hopewell Church by Mrs. Hyde and Mrs. Carrie Bowles, two white Presbyterian missionaries. One by one, more schools emerged. Brown Springs, a public school, Pleasant Hill School, and the Pilgrim Rest School near the Big Woods community.
I started to school, I guess I went when I was 5 years old, and teacher sent me home because I was too young. And we stayed about half a mile from school, maybe 3/4 of a mile from school. We had 2 creeks to cross, and the school was Bronze Springs. And it was a country school. We had first through the 8th grade in the school, and didn't have but the one teacher. And we ate lunch. We cooked lunch on a wood heater. So you can imagine what kind of lunch it was. It was stuff you boil more than you fried, because we didn't have enough time to do fried. We had fried bread on top of the stove. Some good cornbread can go on top of that stove, fried. And the teacher and the oldest kids done the cooking. And we had a good time.
The need to provide a quality education for their children did not change with the move to town. The first Black school in the Wynnewood city limits was the 2-room Douglas School. Its first teacher, Thomas Drake. Later, those same grounds were used to build Lincoln School. Its first principal, J.H. Gresham, from 1904 to 1913. Its last principal, Dean C. James Sr., who remained with the school until 1956, when Wynnewood schools were integrated. In 1956, Lincoln School was a 5th and 6th grade school, changing its name to Parkview. The first black school teacher in the integrated school system was Mrs. May O. Hall. Mrs. Hall began teaching in Wynnewood in 1971 and taught until she retired in 2000. Along the journey toward educational excellence, teachers would challenge and inspire their students. Among those remembered, Mrs. Hattie Clark, Mrs. Abilene C. Matthews, and Mrs. Lorena Jordan.
My first teacher at Brown Spring was Miss Jordan. And then when I went to Lincoln, my first teachers was Miss Clark, Miss James, Miss Grace Alexander, Miss Jordan, Miss Matthews, and Mr. Bufford. And Miss Dean James Sr. was the principal there. And I went there for 10 years.
There was Mrs. Lorena Jordan, and she was a very, I would say, ferocious teacher. She did not play. You know, we all prayed for each other that we'd hurry up and get out of that room. And then, but she was a love in her own way. She was loving. Our teacher was Mrs. Grace Alexander. And Grace she was so young. She was about the age of my mom. So she was fun. She taught us how to sing. She taught us how to be more ladylike.
Miss Jordan, that was the best teacher, Miss Jordan. And she was strict. And she would pat you. And she had one thing in mind as you get in your lesson.
We were having a great time in Wynnewood in the all-black school, and from my remembrance, I didn't even realize that there was another school in Wynnewood.
Black doctors have played a significant part in the well-being of Wynnewood's black community. These doctors ushered in new life, helped the living, and gave comfort to the dying. Among them, Dr. West, Dr. Crosby, Dr. Brumley, Dr. C.A. Griffin, and Dr. Marion Albert Clark, who started his practice in Wynnewood in 1915.
Dr. Clark, who was the only black doctor that I can remember, was the doctor that delivered me. I don't ever remember calling Dr. Clark Marion Abbott, and I don't even remember anybody referring to him as Marion Abbott Clark. But then that wouldn't have been unusual, because the times that we were born and the way we were raised, we always called folks Mr. and Mrs. last names. It was never anything about having to know older folks' first name.
Black Wynnewood has a strong and long history of entrepreneurship. Mrs. Lula Stevenson operated a boarding house on the west side of town. Lorena Kemp owned a rooming house.
I'm Sandy Simpson, the granddaughter of Cyrus Johnson. I was born and raised in Wynnewood, Oklahoma, and graduated from Wynnewood High School. I've lived in Wynnewood all my life, with the exception of the period when I went to Oklahoma State University and graduated from there. My grandfather, Cyrus Johnson, owned a cafe. Long after the doors of his establishment closed, his wife and daughter, my grandmother Catherine and Aunt Louise, continued to provide the community with delicious meals and desserts cooked in their home. They shared their culinary skills with the younger generation. The love for entrepreneurship was passed down to children and grandchildren. My cousin, Titus Ralph Calhoun, owned a Hardee's franchise in Oklahoma City, and I owned Simpson Smokehouse Barbecue in Wynnewood.
A lot of black businesses had thrived because, if you were black, you had to go to, well, you didn't have to necessarily go to a black store, because there were white stores that would allow you to come in through a back door or some type of way. But black businesses thrived because they catered to African Americans, treated them in a way that customers should be treated.
In their heyday, black businesses occupied the west half block of downtown Wynnewood from Curve Boulevard to Seminole Street. Among the businesses, W.J.H. Rice's barbershop, Gabriel Kemp's pool hall. Dixie Smith Jr. operated a grocery store on the corner of Seminole and Washita. Hebron Hart ran a cafe. Von Hunter also operated a cafe. His on North Dene McGee Street in the early 1930s. Black-owned businesses not just surviving, but thriving. Two black cemeteries are located in rural areas north and east of Wynnewood. Hopewell Cemetery is located north in the perimeters of what used to be the Hopewell community. Oak Grove or Pleasant Hill Cemetery is located east of Wynnewood in what used to be the Bick Woods community.
As far as the Hopewell Cemetery Association is concerned, what we do is we are a group of individuals who basically take care of the maintenance of the Hopewell Cemetery. The Hopewell Cemetery dates back to the early 1900s. We can see records for where individuals were buried there at the cemetery in the late 1800s. The people that owned Cherokee Town was a gentleman by the name of John Wallner, and then later on Mr. Shirley owned the place. So that gives you kind of an idea of Hopewell Cemetery and what was there. Again, Hopewell Cemetery right now has probably 350, 400 persons that are buried out there. It's a public cemetery, primarily African American cemetery, and persons are still being buried there at the cemetery to today's date.
Presently, there are 4 out of 6 black churches still active: Mount Carmel, Mount Olive, Mount Zion, and Hopewell Church, which currently operates as a public charity. The Old Folks Reunion has remained as one of the lasting traditions to be upheld by the black community. It has been held the second Sunday in July each year since 1912. Although it began at the Hopewell Church, it now takes place at Mount Zion Church. The story of Black Wynnewood is the story for generations, the story of men and women united in a common cause to build communities that provided a safe haven and opportunity to carve out their own versions of the American dream. The people of the Hopewell community, the Bick Woods, and Black Wynnewood live on as we remember them and tell their stories.
When I grew up in the country, in the Hopewell area, I done a lot of hunting and fishing, and I did some coon hunting with my grandpa, Zach Smith, me and my brother Delbert. I recall selling watermelons in Wynnewood with the wagon and team. We'd haul them from the country to town to sell, and that was with my grandfather. On my dad's side, his name was John McBroom. And we peddled cantaloupes and watermelons and plied gardens with a horse and team.
And Aunt Jill would cook and make pies, and she'd always come get me when my dad was in Wynnewood, and my dad used to sing in it wasn't a quartet. And she would come get me, and I'd go to church with my dad, and my dad would come back over to Aunt Jill's. So that's the way I got to know who my dad was, because my dad and mom at that point had separated, and Everybody went their own way. But it was those kind of relationships that made Wynnewood a great experience.
Gerald Washington.
Just weeks before her death, his aunt, 94-year-old Jewel Washington, was still telling the story of the home she so loved. Well into her 80s, Miss Jewel, the granddaughter of one of the first black settlers, Dixie Smith Sr., led the push to create Project Room 14. It designated Room 14 in the Estridge Hotel Museum as the Black History Room. On February 3, 2013, Jewel Washington was there to cut the ribbon and dedicate the new exhibit, preserving an important part of Wynnewood's history.
Hello, I'm Jacorio Taylor. I was born December 18, 1982. I currently reside in the home of my grandparents, O.C. and Jewel Washington, and their home resides on my great-great-grandmother's property, Mary Jane Washington.
Today, Jewel Washington's grandson has picked up the torch.
I really miss her. She would say, tell the truth. Don't just be telling stories. Make sure what you know is right. The old woman. She taught me so much. Took great pride in telling me all the time that I needed to behave. But she also taught me how to cook. She taught me how to keep house and to take care of myself. And ultimately, that's what I ended up doing in the home that I now reside in, which is also the home that I grew up in. I'm still managing and taking care of what was given me. Every responsibility that my ancestors gave me to continue their legacy, I have continued to keep up. So if I could say my grandmother taught me anything, she taught me how to care. It's important for us to continue legacies like this. And the best way to do it is by continuing to use the things that were left to us. Like this pot. My grandmother received this from her ancestors and used it until her demise. And now, I use it to this day. Pretty much like this chest. I think that they're intended to still be used. That's how you keep memories alive. You keep things in use. Not only to share the precious memory, but it's a little piece of your ancestor continuing on through you.
As executive producer of this documentary, The Hope of Generations, the story of Wynnewood's rich black history, Jacory Taylor is on a mission to keep the stories of Black Wynnewood alive.
Black Wynnewood's history is rich. And it's just not something that you find in history books or that's common to any place that you could go. I mean, it's so important because it's like the element of America that's missing. Right now, we're really feeling the effects of it. I hope that, most importantly, that generations to come continue to remain interested. Not only the black history of Wynnewood, but the black history of America. I think as the fight for racial equality continues on, that the greatest part of that work will be what we can recover. If I could say something great to all of them, I would say thank you. I really would. Because I've lived in many places and I've been places all over the world and none of them have been like Wynnewood. If I had to leave a legacy behind, I would try to leave my best to leave a legacy of joy. I would, because that's the most important thing. I mean, people leave behind terror, they leave behind strife, they leave behind confusion, but no one in my family, not my mother, not my grandmother, even in their demise, did they leave those things. Although we were sad, they still left us with great joy and great memories. And that's what it's all about. Leave behind. I'm going to be the last man standing.
So what is it like to grow up in a community where neighbors were more like family and pride and possibilities flourished? Well, this Hopewell native, Janie Bell Smith, says it best.
Yeah, it was good. It was fine to me.
Yes.